What the fuck is human development? For a long time, we've told ourselves a story that development is surrounded by an increase of wealth. Basically, the more wealth we find in society, the more developed we are. But the Nobel economist Amartya Sen disagrees with this. He explicitly says that wealth is not the goal in and of itself, but that freedom is the goal of development. Basically, Sen argues that freedom is the actual central motivator of human development, and attempts to build up a system around that idea. First, he makes a distinction where he says there's generally been two attitudes towards development. Either the no pain, no gain attitude, which basically suggests that pain is effectively necessary for any kind of development to go ahead. Or there's the second attitude of teamwork makes the dream work, basically that if we all work together, we can see a mutually beneficial increase in all of our developments. Sen takes the second position in this. But for development to be mutually beneficial, we have to think of development as freedom in a particular way. Basically, we need to split freedom into two: the means of freedom and the ends of freedom, which will provide the space for development. We can think of the means as the process of development, basically how do we get to an end. And for this, development has to specifically be the process which expands the freedoms, which act like a feedback loop promoting other freedoms. And then on the other side of that, the actual ends coming out as the opportunities from development are these freedoms that enrich human life. Sen then lists this broad, non-extensive typology of these separate freedoms, and he argues the strength of this is that a lot of systems in the past, when it has come to development, have made implicit value judgments to get to their ends, basically allowing them in the process to trample over certain freedoms in the process of getting to that end. While in this system, the value judgments become explicit in the fact that the means of development has to be a process which explicitly judges what freedoms we're expanding. For example, there's a pretty common argument that we can put up with certain losses of freedom in the face of economic growth, because this wealth will eventually trickle down to developing others. Sen says this is unacceptable. Any process of development that explicitly is reducing your freedom is going against the very idea of development itself. And another part of Sen's system here is the idea of our individual capabilities, which we are able to develop through these freedoms that we're gaining through development. However, again, it's kind of a feedback loop where by increasing our individual capabilities, we're actually able to further the development of freedom as well, because we're able to use our own freedoms better and we're able to input into the system to expand on our existing freedoms. Basically, these capabilities have to be expanded both by public policy, but then are used to influence public policy more efficiently. And this doesn't only apply to public policy, but it also applies to these public institutions and these public facilities, which Sen believes are fantastic places to safeguard individual freedoms, but also require us to publicly support those facilities and institutions, which end up shaping our capabilities. Let's say like health services, social safety nets, the education system, all things which end up shaping our capabilities and what we're actually able to do with our freedom. Sen even uses India and China as contrasting examples, with India, at least at the time, being a good example of having decent political freedoms, but having a not great set of public institutions to actually help the development of your capabilities to make use of those freedoms. China, on the other hand, again, at the time when Sen was writing, was a good example of a place that had pretty good public institutions that increased your general capabilities, but had pretty poor political freedoms to actually make use of those capabilities. And a final point that I would like to make that I think was quite interesting that Sen talks about is another time whenever he tries to approach this kind of idea of the over-reliance on economic freedoms. And he does this by pointing out how we sometimes end up misunderstanding the benefits of markets. He says there's two arguments that generally get used in support of markets. One is that markets grant us the freedom to have opportunities to transact in markets. And the second argument is that there is a freedom granted in the expansion to wealth and income through economic development by markets. The argument basically boiling down to this idea that any restriction of freedom on the market itself is a bad thing because you're reducing the freedom functioning within it. Basically, an argument against regulating markets. Sen says these are two conflated points that end up getting mushed together sometimes. Whenever the first argument about the freedom to transact in markets is concerned with the actual freedom of the process in the market, while the second idea that says you shouldn't be limiting the freedom of the market itself is merely concerned with the outcome but not actually with the process of how the market's working. Basically, leaving it to overlook how freedom is working or not working in the process of the market. And just to clarify, it's not even like Sen here is making a great argument against markets in general. He says markets, in his opinion at the very least, are generally proven to be pretty decent for development. He just thinks that there's been a big overconflation between these two kinds of freedoms that we see when arguing about markets in general.